I want to start by setting the scene for you. It's Passover weekend. Thousands and thousands of Jewish pilgrims are pouring into Jerusalem, a large city by ancient standards. The Passover festival was a big deal. It's an annual celebration where Jewish people got together to celebrate that God had delivered them from Egypt and Egyptian slavery. But the celebration was a little bittersweet. In the first century, Israel was an occupied territory. Israel was occupied by Rome. However, Passover was always a reminder that God could set them free. So could this be the year? I mean, just a few days before, Jesus and his disciples had joined that crowd of people that came into the city, with the crowd cheering him, shouting, "Hosanna," which means save us. Hosanna to the Son of David. In other words, set us free, Jesus, Son of David. The religious leaders had heard about what the crowd shouted when Jesus entered the city, and they were afraid. This may bring the wrath of Rome down on them. And now that Jesus is in the city, they're thinking, this is an opportunity they've been waiting for. They can seize him and have him arrested. If only they can get him alone. The text tells us, but the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him. But there was a caveat, because they were smart. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. We are told later that Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with him how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. And so the stage is set for their plan to be carried out. And their plan would actually succeed. But their objective would not. Because as we will see, it was Jesus' intention all along to give his life away. But before he did that, he wanted to celebrate Passover with his disciples. So he sends some friends out into the city to find a place where he and his closest disciples, the 12, can celebrate the Passover meal together. A place where they won't be interrupted and where they won't be arrested. The place where they could have some final conversations because Jesus knew his time was drawing to a close. The text says, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. As you may know, in the Passover meal, 4 promises of God are remembered and celebrated. 4 cups are filled with wine, and 4 times you drink, symbolizing God's 4 promises. The first promise, God said, I will set you apart from all else, bring you out. Sanctification, it's called. You will be mine. The promise of sanctification. So the first cup of wine is the cup of sanctification. The second promise, I will set you free from being a slave. The promise of deliverance. So the second cup of wine remembers and celebrates God delivering them from slavery. The third promise is the promise of redemption, salvation. God says, I will redeem you. So the third cup of wine is the cup of salvation, redemption. The fourth promise remembered and celebrated is God says, I will protect you. The fourth cup of wine is the cup of protection. So 4 times you consume wine to remember and celebrate God's promises. You can see why it's a big celebration. But there is a 5th cup too, mentioned in the scriptures. The fifth cup is the wrath of God. The prophet Jeremiah wrote, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup, filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. The psalmist says in Psalm 78, for in the hand of the Lord there is a cup, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. Think about it, all the nations, all the sin, all the killing, all the deprivation, all the wrong that has been done, and can that go unpunished? So the rabbis debated, should we include this cup in Passover? After all, it is mentioned in the scriptures that someday God's fury will be given to the nations to drink. They debated, should it be included in the Passover meal? What about our enemies? They said, what about those who have done wrong to us? Do they get off scot-free? For the Jews, they've been in slavery for 400 years. There has to be justice. And for there to be justice, evil must be punished. And they debated. And then they said, and what about our own sin? And God's judgment being poured out on us? Finally, they decided, we can't solve it. So we will wait till Elijah comes, and he will settle the argument for us. So they have to this day, in the Passover, something called Elijah's cup. And Elijah's cup is not just about Elijah's coming. It is also to remind them that someday Elijah would come to decide what is going to happen to the cup of wrath. So Jesus, during his Passover meal, breaks bread saying, this is my body, and goes through each of the cups of wine with him. And at the third cup, near the end of the meal, the cup of redemption, the cup of salvation, he says, this is my blood. This is how Matthew records it. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So Jesus says, all this while taking the third cup, the cup of salvation, the cup of redemption. He's saying, that's what I'm going to bring. But then he says, I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So what cup doesn't Jesus drink? The fourth cup, the cup of protection. So scholars believe Jesus cannot drink from that cup, the cup of God's protection, as he goes to the cross. And Jesus leaves the Passover meal and comes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he begins to think about that cup, that everybody will be subject to the wrath of God. And as he wrestles in that olive garden, that he has to drink it. No, God, no. Not this cup. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, he prays. Take this cup from me, he prays. Yet not my will, but yours be done. And he drank it. He drank it, every drop. Jesus chose this cup. Remember John and James had asked Jesus a few days before, can one of us sit on your right and the other on your left? What did Jesus say to them? And this may seem strange language. He didn't say no or maybe. Let's talk about it. What did he say to them? Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? And then when they arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, in a moment of bravery, starts swinging a sword and cuts off the ear of a servant. As Jesus puts it back, he said to Peter, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? He took the fifth cup so you and I could have this sanctification, deliverance, redemption, protection. The fifth promise is the promise of God's wrath poured out over evil. A cup of wrath that was ours to drink. But God, in his infinite love, knew it meant our destruction. So in an imaginable act of compassion, God chose to drink a cup of wrath. So he suffers our punishment in our place. So the cup of wrath, if it would come to us, would be empty. We get sanctification and deliverance, redemption and protection, but we don't get the fifth cup, his wrath. Jesus took that. As Jesus hung on the cross, alone, naked, he began to drink the shame, the desolation, the destruction that was rightfully ours. Finally, Jesus cries out, "It is finished." It has been emptied. The staggering truth about the cup of wrath is God's love for us cost him everything to die our death. Now we get a glimpse of his act of compassion, his love for us. To get that, we need to go to Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is known as the death psalm. It is the desire of every rabbi and every religious Jew that when they die with the scriptures on their lips. Jews for the last 2,400 years have prayed that when you die, you recite Psalm 22 and you die with Shema on your lips. Remember the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So the first thing you do is meet God after you've said Shema. That's the idea of dying with the scriptures on your lips. Now, they are recorded that when Jewish people, when they were being marched to the Nazi gas chambers, they declared Shema. The Inquisition, the Crusades, they recite Psalm 22 and then Shema. The great Jewish scholar, Rabbi Akiva, he's a leading contributor to the Mishnah, which is the oral tradition of Jewish law. He was a student of Rabbi Gamliel, whom Paul was also a student of. So around about that same time, Rabbi Akiva took part in the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans. He's captured and he's tortured by the Romans for his participation. And before his death, they had him in a cage and they were lowering it into the fire and burning him and lifting him out and then lowering him again into the fire and then lifting him out in a form of torture. And making his followers, his young disciples, because he was a rabbi, watch. And it's recorded that as they lowered him into the flames, he's screaming the Shema and then reciting Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is the death psalm. And I want you to come with me to the cross. Now, you've heard of the 7 words of the cross, or the 7 phrases, or the 7 utterances that Jesus says while on the cross. Now, all 7 sayings, 6 for sure, come out of Psalm 22. And what Jesus is doing is, as he's dying, choking to death, suffering and aching, he is muttering and gasping through the death psalm. And when it comes to a point that reminds him of something, he shouts it. The gospel writer Matthew records it as a loud cry or a shout. This is how it is written. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus says, my God, not Father. Jesus always talks about his Father. But here he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22 verse 1 starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? The psalmist continues later on. He says, you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you. Even at my mother's breast, from birth I was cast upon you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. From the cross, Jesus gasps, mother, your son, your mother. And the text says, from that time on, the disciple John took her into his home. It's as if Jesus goes through Psalm 22, gets to the part about a mother, sees his mother and says those words. Then next the psalm says, my life ebbs away. My bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melting within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. I am thirsty, Jesus cried. Jesus dies reciting the text. Psalm 22, verse 25. Because of you, I offer praise in the presence of the worshippers. In Hebrew, the wording, I offer praise in the presence of the worshippers, is I commit my spirit in this worship. Luke records it like this. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Notice it's recorded as if Jesus is gasping through words, and then in a loud voice he says something he wants everyone to hear. And then Psalm 22 ends with these words, verse 30. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. Or more accurately, it is finished. John then records Jesus' last words as, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Other parts of Psalm 22 speak about, they pierce my hands and my feet. They divide my clothes among them. They cast lots for my garments. So in another way, Psalm 22 is prophetically speaking specifically of Jesus' death. So Jesus is dying and reciting this psalm. Out of context, it would appear that Jesus is saying, God, you failed me. When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? They appear to be such hopeless, despairing words. But these are the exact words of Psalm 22. He is fulfilling the prophetic nature of Psalm 22. But from these words, we also get the deepest revelation of what Jesus is doing. You may have heard the phrase, the passion of the Christ. Why would we refer to the suffering and crucifixion as the passion of the Christ? So what does the word passion mean? Well, in its original Latin meaning, originally the Latin word passion meant suffering. Nowadays, the word passion means romance, heavy breathing, lipstick, perfume. It does. But in that, passion also means love. It's both, isn't it? So the passion of Jesus is, he underwent infinite suffering out of infinite love. And this statement shows us this. When he cries out, it shows us something. First of all, he does not say, my head, my hands, my feet. He's not talking about physical suffering. I mean, he's been flogged. He's experienced all kinds of physical suffering. And he's never raised his voice and never said a thing throughout it. And he doesn't then also say, my friends, the betrayers, the deniers, the deserters. He's not referring to his psychological suffering either. How alone and abandoned he might have been. See, up to this moment, Jesus has been unbelievably calm. Through the arrest, the beatings, no matter what has happened to him. No matter how much emotional and psychological suffering, he's completely in control. There is no complaint. So when he starts to shout out here, this is something different. This is something else. This is something way beyond physical suffering. This is beyond the torture he has been through. This is the psalm being said, but remember, this is also God's wrath being poured out upon him. The fifth cup. No one has ever done what he's doing. No one has ever been cast away from God's sight. So whatever he experienced, and this goes beyond my ability to explain and to understand, would have been infinitely greater than what anybody else would have ever had to bear. So it's much more than just quoting Psalm 22 when Jesus says it. Jesus is saying, though God is pouring his wrath out on me, I'm holding on to his word. I'm sticking to the plan. Though God is condemning me and turning his face away from me, I'm holding on. There is something he's doing. There is something he's accomplished, working it, holding on to it to the very end. What is Jesus' passion? In the full sense of the biblical term, you and I. We are his passion. We are what he is dying for. We are what he is infinitely suffering for. He's not just suffering, he's suffering for a love. It's a passion. When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not just uttering it or just quoting. He's on the one hand saying, I've been absolutely forsaken. And on the other hand, he's saying, but I'm doing this for a reason. I'm doing this for a purpose. I am holding on to the last drop. And in this particular cry explains that he is willing to take infinite suffering in obedience to God's plan out of love for us. If that's what the cross means, passion, then in the full biblical sense of the word passion, what it tells us is this: Jesus sets aside his divinity to come down and to bear the evil and injustice in this world, and even to die under it, so that someday he can end evil without having to end us. There is one place in the scriptures where God says to an earthly father, "Now I know that you love me." God says it to one of his favorites, to Abraham. And when he says it, when he says it to him, he says, "I know that you love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love, from me." You see, now we can say it back to God. We know that you love us as our Heavenly Father because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love. Psalm 22 emphasizes how in the pain and the suffering there is love and there is victory. Interestingly, when you look at history, all the other religious founders of the great religions die old and successful. Buddha dies at 80 years old, achieves enlightenment. That's why they call him the Buddha. Muhammad lives into his 60s. He doesn't die until he unites all of Arabia under one kingdom, under one faith. Even in the Old Covenant, the great leaders die old and successful. Moses led the children of Israel to the border of the Promised Land. He's over 100 years old. King David dies at 70 after 40 years on the throne. All die old and successful. In an absolute contrast, you have Jesus, who dies age 33 in agony, abandoned by everyone, even his closest followers. He dies on a cross, and as his followers, those who believe in him, we say, that's where my salvation was won. Because the very last thing Jesus says on the cross is, "It is finished. It is completed. I did it." When Jesus died on the cross, what he was saying was the exact opposite of what Buddha said when he died. If you go to the Buddhist scriptures, the last thing Buddha said was, "Strive without ceasing." The last thing Jesus says is, "Don't you dare keep striving. I did all the striving for you." Those are two completely different approaches. As our substitute, he says, "It is finished." What he is really saying to us, and this is so incredible, obey because it is finished. Don't obey in order to finish it. The one is obedience in striving and never quite knowing, is it enough? Have I done enough? Am I good enough? The other is obedience in the joy and realization that it is finished. Those are two completely different psychologies. One will burn you out and will grind you into the ground, and the other one involves responding simply to what has been done for you. Now, what is so intriguing, Jared? It's as if Matthew is showing us how hard it is for people to get this, even for us to get it. Matthew records, they hear Jesus cry out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He then writes, when some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." When they heard his Aramaic, he's speaking in Aramaic at this point, "Eli, Eli," it sounds like the short word for Elijah. So they thought, oh, maybe he's calling for Elijah. And what's intriguing about this is they are religious people. They know the scriptures, but they miss who he is and what he has come to accomplish. In fact, Matthew records, immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. It's like they're moved and they have pity for Jesus, so they offered him something to drink. But they don't get it. They completely miss what is going on. On the other hand, Matthew also records there is a centurion there, a Roman, a pagan, a violent man. And when he witnesses all that takes place with Jesus on the cross, the centurion says, surely he was the Son of God. And it's as if Matthew is saying, this pagan, he gets it. It's this outsider who gets it. And here are these religious folk, these good people, and they don't. Because it's easy for us religious folk, me included, to slip into striving and to somehow think we are doing a good job. You think we're trusting in Jesus for our salvation when we're actually trusting in our own good works. You see, salvation is by grace alone. And it's not through your pedigree, and it's not through your goodness, and it's not through your respectability. Jesus' message on the cross was this: it is finished. I have done it. I have emptied the cup, and you are worth it. You are worth it. And some of you need to hear that today. Jesus would say to you, I did it for you. You are worth it. Let's leave it there. Let's stand and go straight into the communion prayer.